So I'll move on now to our next expert, Professor John McKendrick, who is a Professor for Social Justice and co-director of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit. I'm sure that John doesn't really need an introduction. His research covers a wide variety of children's rights aspects, including particularly children's play and poverty. And John was the director of Play Scotland from 2007 to 2017 and published extensively on play. And in his role as co-director of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit, again, is one of Scotland's great leaders on focusing on poverty and rights. And one of the great things, as John will lead us into now, is your ability to really link to the work of practitioners and campaigners beyond the academic work, but deeply based in the research that you do. So very much looking forward to your presentation, Professor McKendrick, which is entitled What We Are and What We Could Do, Prospects and Challenges for Strengthening Scotland Through Early Years Education and Childcare. And there will be time at the end of Professor McKendrick's presentation to have some questions and answers. So you'll see over to the side of your screen, the right-hand side, the Q&A box. So please start populating that with your questions as we go, and then we'll come to that after Professor McKendrick speaks and have some really good opportunity to delve a bit deeper into that. So I'll pass to you, Professor McKendrick.
Many thanks, Bruce, and many thanks, Paul. Paul very kindly shared his slides with me at the weekend there, and this very much builds on the arguments and points that Paul has made. Cupcakes and muffins, I want you to log that at the back of your mind. I'm going to come back to that as I move through the presentation. I find it useful to understand where people are coming from, because we all have different backgrounds and biographies, and if you want to understand the opinions that I am presenting, then perhaps it's useful to understand the kind of biography that led me to them. So just a few points about myself. My family, I like to say, emigrated from the east end of Glasgow, private ownership, to a new town in the 1970s. Social mobility in a very interesting way, because they moved from private sector to public sector, but felt as if that was a move up in the world, from a house with an indoor toilet to a house with 4 bedrooms and 2 toilets and a bathroom. So social mobility, but a very odd form of mobility, is something that's part of my biography. I certainly had parenting that promoted independence. You know, maybe it was a generational thing, but this is a picture of me age 13 and a 10-day holiday that I planned myself with my 14-year-old pal up to Fort William. And again, I want to come back to that about, you know, what we do in terms of working with young people and what our goals are. I've also, I've been selective here. I've left out the area that didn't fit, but for most of my life, I've lived in areas that, according to the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation that Paul referred to, would be understood to be areas of multiple deprivation. I currently live in one. I started out in life in one, and as I say, I've spent most of my adult life in areas that are considered to be deprived. But I would strongly argue the case that poor places are not all bad, and actually provide many opportunities in many ways. And it's a nuanced point that we want to understand if we want to work with that in terms of policy and in terms of opportunity. So that's where I'm coming from. That's my background. But I also want to tell you about my weekend. My weekend was slightly atypical. It was an unusual one. I had the good fortune of the 2 grandkids came to stay with us at the weekend. 3-year-old Shay, who has just moved into the big class in his nursery school, and 6-year-old Finn, who's is a P2 student, so very much in the age group that we're concerned with. They were slightly late arriving on Saturday because Finn had his football class in the morning before coming up to Grandad's. We spent some time in the house. You'll see the electronic toy at the side there that Shay's playing with while Finn's waiting patiently to get out. That electronic toy is Shay's work computer. Is not his toy as far as he's concerned. We went to a riding arena. You'll see that the first thing that Finn did when he went to riding arena was found what I would see to be a dump of rubbish, but he's seen as an opportunity to climb, you know, have a little bit of extra fun. An adult wouldn't have seen that, but a child most certainly did, making opportunity from something that others, certainly adults that maybe have lost that sensitivity, would not. And we put them to work. My older children and my wife have bought a horse in the last few weeks. We didn't pay national minimum wage rates. We maybe gave them a bar of chocolate and crisps. but they enjoyed it. You know, they did their bit as they mucked around the horses. I don't get it. I don't understand the pleasure of horses, but it's something that everybody else enjoyed. And there's Finn laying the bed for the horse at night. They were brave enough to have a go on the horse. And then we had, don't look at the food, I'm sure it's not an advert for health eating in Scotland, but we had a nice family meal at the end of the night. And then after a good bedtime story, the boys were zonked out for the day. We woke up on Sunday morning and we had the good fortune of living not too far away from an outstanding park in North Lanarkshire in Drumpellier Country Park, modelled in Crannog, or themed at least in a Crannog. And we made the most of what that park had to offer, both in terms of the formal and regular play opportunities. Grandad getting involved here. We could read that in two ways. You know, should adults get involved in children's play and playgrounds? We might argue it facilitates and enriches, but there's always a risk that it's overprotective, and perhaps is not the best thing for kids. And certainly, again, going back to this theme this time with Shay about, you know, problems being opportunities, that the big puddle that adults gingerly walked through that had accumulated was not a problem for Shay. It was a jumping opportunity to splash in puddles with the wellies, as a big double thumbs up demonstrate. And of course, the obligatory ice cream at the end of the day, because it was the first inklings of spring before we headed home. Cupcakes and muffins there. I mean, what you have there then is an opportunity that might be familiar to many of us that are in this seminar and many of wider families in Scotland. The icing might be that perhaps I'm in a fortunate position financially that we can offer a little bit more. You know, we can get a horse riding experience because, you know, we managed to buy a horse in the last few weeks. We can travel to that little bit extra distance to go to that outstanding park that's a little bit further away, rather than perhaps the reasonable one that's not quite got the same opportunity on our doorstep. But we might argue roughly it's the same experience that many children would have access to. But no, many children don't have access to these opportunities that perhaps we take for granted, or perhaps those are the very most comfortable positions that Paul was referring to in his presentation have something that's a little bit higher quality, but very much the same as the majority. Many kids don't have access to these opportunities. The idea of travelling 5 miles to a park would be a problem for some families, you know, beyond their capabilities, beyond their resources, beyond their means to do so. Forget horse riding, that's just a world apart for many children in Scotland. Because as Paul demonstrated with regard to educational outcomes, and as I'm suggesting here with regard to leisure opportunities, we do not live in a Scotland where all children have access to the same opportunities that Scotland does afford, that we actually offer. I want to tell you also something about my 2 adult children. I've got 2 older children. One of these, this is not all my grandkids as well, just for the avoidance of doubt here. This is Lauren's primary 2 class. She's now a primary 1 teacher. She's teaching in the early years. Always been committed practitioner, always is although primarily really family oriented, a fantastic parent, you know, a credit to our dad without a doubt. But she's a very passionate teacher, really believing in the power of education. Dealing in a school that's probably challenging, you know, it's right there in terms of Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation. A lot of pupil equity fund money has flown into that school by virtue of the population that's there. But Lauren lives a good life. You know, her and her partner both work full time, and she has a profession that she makes a good contribution to and prospers through that. My son Corey also actually works in early years. He's a very different background though. He was a contemporary performance practice student at the Conservatoire in Glasgow. He works with it's done some work with an outstanding organisation that many of us will be familiar with, Starcatchers. He's freelance, Corey. Sometimes describing himself as an artist, sometimes as a play assistant, you know, sometimes as somebody who works in theatre, and loves what he does. And I've had the good fortune to watch Corey do what he does as well. But it's a precarious existence that Corey has, because through no fault of the organisations that employ them, the labour market in which Corey makes a contribution is much more precarious. It's much more short term. And while Corey has enjoyed that and indeed celebrated the fact that he has that flexibility to choose where he works and who he works with, I think it leads to a much less comfortable life. But cupcakes and muffins, they're doing the same thing. They're contributing towards the early development. They're working in very different ways towards the enrichments of children's lives, be it in a less formal way or a more formal sector. just the icing that comes for Lauren is the stability that comes with reasonable remuneration that leads her to live a very different life. So I think we also have to think about the workers in the early childcare sector as well as the opportunities that are afforded to children. Now, as Bruce had introduced and as Paul had alluded to then, that one of my research interests is not just play and opportunity, but it's very much concerned with poverty and the scourge of poverty that presents within Scotland. And again, being one of life's optimists, I see both misery and hope in the points that I want to make over the next few slides. Misery in that, 250,000 of our children, 240,000 children currently living in poverty at the current time within Scotland. An abomination in an affluent nation to have so many children, to have so little by way of household resources. And as we now realise and have realised for some time, the vast majority of these children live in a household in which at least there is some work by at least one of the adults in that household. We have a significant national problem, but we do have a national ambition to eradicate that. These charts there are the metrics that we use to chart progress. A couple of points that are worth making in relation to this. One, the direction of travel is not good. We are heading in the wrong direction at the current time, not dramatically, but the rates of poverty are slightly increasing. At the very best, they're reasonably stable, but they've slightly increased in the last few years. But we are looking to do the opposite. We're looking to dramatically reduce as we head towards 2030. And I would kind of hope here that I'm talking to people that already know this agenda. I've wasted 20 seconds of your time perhaps, but it's important, I think, that we recognise that. A national shared ambition that we all, regardless of who we are and what our professional competencies and practices are, we have a responsibility to make a difference to. Optimistic I see that we can make a difference if we do the right things, and it's pertinent to the early years. Paul had pointed out that the risk of adverse childhood experiences, strengths and difficulties, questionnaires, metrics, etc. are uneven across our demographics, and it's exactly the same with poverty. We have identified, and I say we, I'm very comfortable saying we, it's a Scottish Government stroke local authority stroke NHS agenda, but it's also one, as I say, that we all have a contribution to make and should sign up to. And we've identified six groups that have more than their fair share of that poverty. Now, that's not to say that these are the only children whose poverty is important, but it is to say that if we manage to tackle the poverty in these groups, then we'd be dealing with 90% of Scotland's poverty. So it's a pragmatic tool, but it does emphasise to us that certain groups are more at risk than others. And I think in terms of being in belonging conference, the last two boxes are significant. Much higher risk if there's a baby in the household, super high risk if the mother is aged under 25, which reasonably we can assume, and we could evidence if we so desired, that relates to younger children. So it's a particular problem for younger children, the risk rate of poverty in Scotland. This demonstrates the point. The top graph is the change through time for mothers and rate of poverty. There are low numbers with mothers, so we have to be cautious with the data. The middle bar is the risk rate for children, all children in a household that has a baby in it, and the bottom bar is the risk rate of poverty for all children. And we can see a higher risk rate for those where there is a young child, in this case a baby, we're using within the household. So a particular problem for those in the early years. And as Paul has very ably demonstrated, that's got consequences that go way beyond pounds and pence in people's pockets in terms of how it's associated, and indeed is probably a causal problem for some of the outcomes, educational, social and emotional, the result for children. But as I say, I'm one of life's optimists, and I'm sure the fact that we've signed up to this conference means that many of you are the same. And I truly believe that we can make a difference if we do the right things. But it is right things that have to be done. Choices have to be made. Resources have to be reallocated. And we have to be alert to what that requires. So I don't see poverty as something that's inevitable. I don't see poverty as something that people themselves cause for themselves. And I also don't see poverty as something that the abstract hand of the capitalist economy is forced upon the very most vulnerable. There may be grains of truth in all these points to some extent, but I think the big argument that I make is let's do the right things and let's make a difference. And, I'm not trying to sell this book. I can assure you I don't get any royalties from this whatsoever. In fact, I maybe shouldn't say it for CPAG, but CPAG have made the book freely available, so you can download this at absolutely no cost. But the reason I put this book up is it demonstrates to us that there is that sense of purpose that goes beyond academics, it goes beyond government officials, be them national or local, it goes beyond NHS, and of course the work of Bruce and Bruce's commissioners, who completely get the significance of this issue in children's lives. Because the back end of that book has always been, and we produce this in the run-up to every Scottish election, a contribution from different professional groups outlining what should be done in their particular professional area to deal with the issues that poverty presents for children. So there's contributions in there from early education as well as housing, transport and many other fields. A sense of purpose then that's a shared one for the nation. And again, this is the graph that we have, the driver framework, that we understand then if we do these things, then we can make a difference. And this is very much to try and harness local energy to do the right things locally. Increase income from employment, reduce the cost of living, and increase income from social security and benefits in kind. But I think the interesting thing for today for being and belonging is that the affordability of affordable and accessible transport and childcare is seen to be one of the factors that could lead to increased from employment and would reduce the cost of family living, which would be seen to make a positive difference in terms of tackling and reducing child poverty. So it's part of the mix. Now, what goes on within early education, what goes on within all the different realm of activity in early childcare is seen to be part of that broader effort in tackling poverty. But I'll come back to that with some critical thoughts as I move towards the end of the presentation. Some words of caution. One word of caution, I don't want to go overdwell on this, but the British Social Attitude Survey is another wonderful resource, not as good a resource as Paul referred to with Gus this morning, but nevertheless a very useful resource for shining a light in what we think. And the British Social Attitude Survey allows us to compare ourselves and others. We can compare what we think in Scotland with other parts of the UK. We'd like to think of ourselves sometimes as very different, much more egalitarian than our colleagues south of the border. And there's a tiny little bit of evidence to suggest that perhaps. But I think also if we think about our attitudes towards poverty, I think there's some issues that come through that we're not quite as understanding. There are senses of which we're comfortable at blaming individuals for the circumstances they find themselves in. The most common explanation that's used by people in Scotland, which is these data here, is that the addictions and abuse of a parent contribute towards child poverty. Now, undoubtedly, if a parent is grappling with addictions issues, then that will contribute to a poorer quality of life and possibly poverty for the children in that household. But it absolutely is not the main cause of child poverty in Scotland. So just as a word of caution is that I don't think we quite fully understand what poverty is yet. And I think there are still hearts and minds to be won there in terms of truly understanding the issue in order to deal with the problem, in order to enrich young children's lives. And again, this is me moving towards the key points for being and belonging, that work doesn't always pay. Now, work does pay for the vast majority of people in Scotland, but the share of children in poverty in Scotland who live in a household with some adult work has been steadily increasing through time. Now, it's beginning to bottom out a bit, but it has been increasing. So this idea then, this silver bullet of work being the route out of poverty is not so simple. It possibly is the way out, but we have to think about the nature of that work. Think back, cupcakes and muffins to my son compared to my daughter. Now, I'm not saying my son lives in poverty, but it's a much more precarious existence when we're operating in some sectors of the labour market, regardless of the social value of that work. So why does these issues matter to us, the being and belonging arguments there? Well, this is a graph from Deloitte, and this is Deloitte then thinking about the world of work that lies ahead. And, the world of work will be different, it lies ahead. And they outline here what they call 7 disruptors that will very much change the nature of that work. And one of the 7 is an explosion in contingent work, this more precarious existence, not regular employment that I'm fortunate enough to enjoy, not consultancy work that's well paid and plenty of opportunity, but really vulnerable contingent work is something that's seen to be one of the disruptors that lie ahead. But largely that understanding of the world of work that lies ahead doesn't seem to me to feature early childcare issues particularly prominently. That's a world of future work, an agenda, if you like, that's not sensitive to the issues that perhaps are pertinent to what we're interested in today. This is another type of world of work that could lie ahead. It's a care economy. It's one in which care is valued, It's one in which care, and I talk about early education as well as social care here as part of a broader care economy, in which we view this as social investment. If we think back to Paul's presentation, some of the problems that result could be reduced and lessened if there were better investment in the early years and early education. And I certainly would, in responding to Paul's prompt, I would be looking for more than 30% to be excellent of early education as part of the solution to that. Although it's very unusual, I think, to say that we have any type of social provision in which the least affluent and most affluent enjoy the same level of quality, and that certainly is a plus for the sector that the evidence suggests that's the case. But this type of vision of the economy, very different to what Deloitte outlined, would be a radically different Scotland. It would be a radically different role for early education and childcare, much more important and prominent in what Scotland is aspiring to be. And it shifts early education away from being a problem. Now, that seems an odd thing for me to say, and certainly to this audience, to perhaps being a solution. Because if we think back to the way that the employment labour market works, then there is an argument, I think, to be made that it's part of the problem at the current time. If we think about the investment that goes into early education and childcare, short-term opportunities is wonderful, and I do genuinely mean as wonderful as investment in Get Into Summer was last year, and the commitment of the Scottish Government to continue that funding into this summer, and it's welcome investment, but it's short-term for many of the workers that are involved there. It's not going to lift many of the workers out of poverty that are in these opportunities. And again, if we move through the regular time of the regularity of the school year, then those outside perhaps regular paid jobs in formal education, again, are a risk of being more of a precarious and vulnerable workforce. So I think having a care economy where we really truly value the contribution that's making to society alerts us to the possibility of avoiding a problem. That what we don't do by investing more in childcare is actually create an incidental, unintended consequence of a precarious work environment for many skilled professionals and committed practitioners who don't enjoy the types of employment conditions and remuneration that certainly that I do and others like me do. And linked in with that, and I'm just moving towards the last few points in conclusion, and very much linking to some of the presentations we'll hear this afternoon, we have other aspirations in Scotland to have for example, and just an example here, a play-friendly nation, where we truly value the contribution that makes to the wider society. Early education and childcare is not just about formal education and upping skills, it's about enriching children's lives. And I think unless we truly value that, then we're very unlikely to make these transformative differences into the type of country that values that work and therefore is more likely to remunerate that work properly. Play then is what children do and young people do in their own time for their own reasons, free from the control and direction of adults. Note for self, should I be holding my 3-year-old grandson when he's on that, I forgot the word, the seesaw in the morning. Now, I did that because my defence is I was throwing him down violently and he was getting a tickle in the tummy and he liked it. But there's a case to be made that perhaps we over-parent, and that I think creates stresses for the parents, and I think it reduces opportunity for the kids. Link back to that early slide and children and independence in terms of what we want as a country. And again, very final point before I make my last conclusion. In the education sector, there's much effort then for practitioners to come together to think about what they can do to contribute to these broader agendas. The cost of the school day, wonderful programme led by CPAG. The EIS, the Education Union, very focused on the work that they can do in education to tackle child poverty in the classroom. Very good examples of practitioner groups being alert to their responsibilities to the agenda. And I think that would lead me to raising a challenge that I think when I think about the type of country that I want Scotland's children to grow up in, as well as one that absolutely children's rights is smack bang in centre, I wanted to be more playful, full of play. I wanted to be more playful in terms of the way in which we approach life. But absolutely, what is top priority for me is making it more equitable. And I don't see these as agendas that are inconsistent, but we have to be alert to the challenges that face. I hope that's a useful contribution to the day, and I'll hand back to Bruce.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, John. As always, incredibly insightful. We do have a few minutes now for questions, and some of them have come in, so we've got some questions and some chat. I'd just like to start though just by a quick reflection that came through really strongly for me in your presentation. Poverty is a human rights issue. It impacts on every aspect of children's life. Play is a human rights issue. It impacts across other rights. The right to education is about developing children to their fullest potential. So it's much more narrow, much broader than the kind of attainment focus we sometimes get stuck on. But play is actually set out as a separate right for a very good reason, because we recognize play as something distinct even from the most broad understanding of education. I think that came through so powerful, and the need to support families as a children's rights issue. We've got UN Convention on the Rights of the Child commitment to incorporation, unfortunately being delayed at the moment, which I'm concerned about. But that says we need to use all available resources to the maximum extent possible to ensure the fulfillment of children's rights, particularly economic, social, and cultural rights. And so I think that point that you make around kind of rights-based budgeting and ensuring sustainable funding as a good investment, and that actually makes economic sense because of the savings in the justice system and the mental health system and the physical health system. And so I think that came through really strongly. I'd also like to pass on our thanks to Shay and Finn and the rest of your family for being part of the presentation that I think made us all smile. And you'll see in the chat that that you brought a great deal of joy to lots of people. So I'll start by one of my own questions, I think, and then we've got a couple of questions in the chat. Again, I love your optimism. I love your call at the end there that we need to be more playful, and to bring in more equality. A question I ask to children and young people when I speak to them is often, if you're the First Minister or the Prime Minister, you've got a magic wand, all the power in the world, John, what's the one thing that you would do first to bring about those outcomes that you wanted us to highlight on?
Well, I think that the magic wand would need to wave over the people and get them to view things differently, because I kind of truly believe that sense of it's not just one big silver bullet that's going to transform Scotland, but it's a different way of thinking. It's a way of shifting what we want and what we recognise value to be. So, part of what I'm interested in is planting all the seeds that will make all the differences. It's not something that will come top down, it's something that will come bottom up. And I think we've lost a few things through generations, and maybe it's an age thing. Maybe I'm getting to an age where I'm looking back with rose-tinted glasses, but I don't think so. I think that, while we have progressed in so many ways, we've also regressed in a few. I think our lives are far more time stressed. I think we manage children too much, and I think that's a particular challenge for the audience in being and belonging. And it's a balance that has to be struck carefully. So maybe that magic wand, that one thing that I would do is, open up that debate. What can we do, and what can you do? Ask everybody would be the question, and I think we'll get a whole series of solutions. What can you do to make sure that children are protected, but at the same way to allow them to prosper, and to prosper with a degree of independence? We are facilitators rather than providers of opportunity for children, and I think we've lost a little bit of that through time.
Absolutely, I strongly agree with you. And one of the things that you touched upon in your presentation as well is the need to support the early years workforce. And we've got a couple of questions that have come in around that. Deborah Meechan asks how you feel about the current state of early year practitioners. And then Karen Flynn had a linked question, which was around, when discussing closing the attainment gap, it's recognised that there's real challenges on early years and the critical lack of quality of experienced practitioners due to the dilution of the workforce through expansion. So could you give us your thoughts on where we're at with kind of early years practitioners, and build on the thoughts that you had around how we support them and build the profession?
Sure, I'm always happy to admit my limitations, and I know much less about early years practice than the vast majority of people in here. But some general points I think that are pertinent to that is that we don't value it enough. If you value something enough, you're more likely to remunerate it properly. You're more likely to invest in training. We don't seem to. Childhood studies almost seems to be a default. If you haven't become a teacher, maybe you could do childhood studies as an option, rather than actually something that is in and of its own right, something that's truly of value. And in the UK, there are very few play degrees, for example. I've been an external examiner to Gloucestershire, University of Gloucestershire, the play degree no longer operating now. To University of Northumbria and Newcastle, play degree no longer operating now, and to Leeds Beckett, or was Leeds Beckett then, a play degree there, no longer operating now. We've never had one in Scotland. So, play just being an example there. I don't think we value it enough in order to recognise that, we need to foster those skills. We need to, enthuse people that this is a career in which they can prosper within. I do somehow see that unless we properly value it, and unless we invest in the workforce to enable them to get the very most out of their practice, then we won't make that progress. And it's maybe, you know, I'm sure we're going to hear in the afternoon from other presentations, Peter Moss, for example, about, you know, the type of early years environment that we could have. And it's very much in tune with that type of thinking there.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Strongly agree. And in terms of this rights-based budgeting as well, that means ensuring that we put the resources in where they need to be. We're getting close to time, but I'm going to squeeze in a couple of questions further. Sue Palmer comments that the definition of childhood from the UN is birth to 8, but the early years definition we use within the Curriculum for Excellence covers nursery and P1, so talking about up to 5, but why don't we have a broader understanding of kind of early years covering up to that higher level? And then I'll also just include another comment which was around from Kelly M, who said about the strong link between early years childhood experience and the impact on development, and she links to the promise. And what about the increase and the normalization of family support, and how do we take a whole family support to that approach throughout early childhood and a broader definition and throughout childhood as a whole? So I put a few in there, and you've just got a couple of minutes to respond. Sorry, John.
I can go for that. Sue's point then about the broader definition. I think many educational practitioners in the very early stages are practicing that, if you know, even if it's not defined as such. You know, the play-based curriculum and a play approach to the very early years of primary school is something that's become more prevalent, more practice shared, more authorities keen to endorse it and encourage it. So, you know, yes, it should be broader. I would agree with Sue. The early years, I think we should see, has been a longer age range. But I think the good news is that many that are working in the sector are embracing, you know, this early years thinking about how best to nurture children in the early stages of school. You know, very much about settling children into school rather than educating in the very early years. It's as much a social issue as a very formal education issue. So I would completely agree with Sue. A broader conceptualization would be helpful, and I think already, and to some extent, the practitioners get that and agreed with it. Kelly's point of the promise and a broader family approach. Well, I mean, I always are going to support that, because I believe then that, you know, I believe in the family first and foremost is the thing that's going to make the biggest difference. You know, it's not a state provision; it's the family that will make the biggest difference to children's lives. And supporting families in order to make that is necessary in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases it's necessary to enable that family to overcome the challenges, be they economic, be them, you know, traditions, whatever they face. So absolutely supporting families is really important to do that, and not just seeing families as being a problem, but seeing families as being the solution. I think we have to rethink that. I think sometimes when we invest social investment, we do so with a deficit mindset. I think we as far as possible, we want our social investment is to be with, you know, the mindset of prosper, that what we're doing is properly investing and enabling rather than dealing with a problem.
Fantastic, and I think that really encapsulates your ongoing optimistic view and that advice you gave earlier about looking at it through a child's eyes and how they see family and supports. And that very much goes to the heart of the Convention on the Rights of the Child about developing this family environment of happiness, love and understanding. John, your presentation's provoked a lot of discussion now, it's which I'll invite you to have a look at, some really powerful comments around how we bring play into older childhood as well. Why do we stop focusing on play? Are we commoditizing play in terms of looking at it as something to assess rather than something to kind of develop and encourage? So there's lots of chat, which I hope will lead on to the rest of the day, but we'll leave it there for just now, and I'll invite you, John, to engage in some of that chat throughout the day. Thank you so much. If we were here in person, as I said earlier, people would be on their feet stamping and laughing and showing their appreciation. So I'm sure they're doing that in their homes at the moment, and I'm sure that you can feel the kind of the love and respect that's being shown to you. Unfortunately, not in person, but thanks so much, John.